Hello, my name is Dr. Sass Brown, and I'm a researcher, writer, and educator on ethical fashion. So I'm also the program lead on Kingston University's newest MA, which is called Sustainable Fashion, Business and Practices. So as part and parcel of that, one of the things I often focus on is strategies to keep fashion and textiles in use for longer, with a material use and reuse, both pre and post-consumer waste, as well as fiber reclamation. In fact, that was the focus of my second book entitled Refashioned, which was published way back in 2003, and you can see on screen here. So as a writer and educator, I'm usually invested in tangible applications and lessons, if you like, rather than simply theory. So what I like to do is share best practices so that we can learn from each other and collectively we can have an impact. So to do that, what I generally do is I talk about inspirational designers and brand solutions and the lessons that we can learn from them. So the mainstream fashion system, as we all know, I'm sure, is based on a linear economy, and it's a take, make, and waste model. So this is actually the main manufacturing model for all kinds of products, not just apparel. And the meaning is pretty self-explanatory because we take the raw materials, we make clothing from them, and once we use the clothing, we discard it when it's no longer of use to us. And so this is also a linear model because it's a straight line from what we call earth to dirt. So the earth where the fiber is extracted from and the landfill where it is discarded into. And so there are a multitude of impacts from textile and garment disposal on both people and planet. And I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you already have some indication of the scale of the problem and the associated impacts. So I'm not going to go into any depth here. There are far more reliable resources to get those stats from. So one of the main challenges I come across when talking to designers about the utilization of waste is an oversimplification and understanding of the complexity of the garment supply chain and an over-reliance on the obvious sources of post-consumer garment waste and dead stock fabric left on the roll. So when waste is actually embedded in the entirety of the value chain, not just the end of the textile and the garment life cycles, there is waste right from the extraction of raw materials, whether those materials are natural or synthetic in origin, cotton left in the field, lost during the baling and the cleaning processes, damages and quality control failures from the spinning stage or the weaving stage, as well as dyeing, printing, and the finishing of the fabric itself. And that's just in fashion textiles. There are, of course, a multitude of other material sources, such as the military, the automotive industry, transportation, interior design, and again, both at pre and post-consumer. So, not to mention overproduction and cancelled orders of both the fabric and of the garments. And all of that is just through the production of the product. Then we have the enormity of the scale of waste coming from post-consumption and the discarding of garments and textiles that are no longer wanted. So all of this constitutes an absolute mountain of wasted fiber, fabrics, and garments. Well beyond the dead stock fashion fabric left on the roll or the discarded post-consumer fashion waste. So for that reason, I prefer to talk generally about the less obvious sources of material waste, as well as some of the strategies that can be used for scaling upcycling. So things that impact the design process beyond a one-by-one reclamation process. So some of the designers I'm going to share are no longer in business, or they've changed the focus of their work. They may not be recent, but nevertheless, they still act as really great examples of various processes and strategies. I think, though, before I do that, I need to determine terminology or what I'm going to use. The terminology I'm going to use is one of the problems that we constantly have is when we're talking about sustainable fashion is the different definitions or understandings that we all have in the utilization of the same terminology. So I tend to use the term cyclability rather than upcycling or recycling. And that's because it incorporates both terms by default. But there is, of course, also downcycling, and downcycling refers to the materials that are reutilized down the value chain. So, for example, wasted virgin materials, which are used for insulation or car seat stuffing. So recycling, of course, simply refers to the materials that are reused, and upcycling refers to materials that are made more valuable through the investment of time and skill. So upcycle garments, for example, from discarded clothing would be a good example of that. Finally, the term circularity is probably the most misused term of all. Circular fashion is a term that was actually defined by Dr. Anna Brismar back in 2014. And it's the utilization of a product at the end of its life as the raw materials for the production of the next product. Not once, that's upcycling, that's not circularity, but actually ad infinitum until the materials are no longer of use and can safely be returned to the biosphere. And of course, not all fabrics can safely be returned to the biosphere. So what I think I want to do is to divide some solutions into examples, into categories of both pre and post-consumer reuse. And so let's begin with some of the more obvious examples and move on to the less obvious or more obscure. So I want to begin with a brand that utilizes textile headers and swatches. So those are the material swatches that you can get from mills and textile agents, the large swatches of fabric that you order before you define your sampling or your production orders to see what the hand is like, how they interact with the other materials, and you define your collection. And so this brand is called Piece by Piece. And as you can see from the images here in the slide, that the designs are made up of patchwork pieces that are patched together into these predetermined size and scale. And because they're predetermined and those sizes and scales are based on the size of the material textile headers that they source from agents and directly from mills, it allows them to cut multiples of a style. So the garment patterns stay exactly the same, but the fabric combinations constantly change. So that is one strategy for scaling. So this is a Cambodian brand called Tonlé, and they work with both pre and post-consumer waste, but I'm going to focus here on their pre-consumer waste, which, although they do utilize dead stock fabric, that's not what I'm going to look at right now. So this is leftovers from other garment producers. So the offcuts of fabric that are normally discarded and thrown away through garment production, all those pieces that are detracted once the garment is cut out. And they have found strategies to work with to utilize the tiniest of scraps. They're a zero waste company, so they are committed to not producing any waste, even a small amount of waste, through their own production. And so one of the common fabrics that they utilize is jersey. So jersey, of course, has an inherent stretch within it. So they cut the jersey into narrow strips, stitch them all together into a long length, and then they can be used to knit sweaters. So both these pieces here are hand knitted out of the textile waste of jersey fabrics that have been stitched together. So this is Swedish brand Nudie Jeans, and they use a fairly similar technique, but instead of knitting their leftover denim fabric, they partner with a hand weaving company to recycle their shredded denim into interior products such as rugs, and you can see them on the right of the slide here. So one of the techniques that all of these brands utilize is they pre-sort their textiles into colors, and this allows them to scale their production up. So in the case of Piece by Piece, they've already predetermined the size and the scale of their pattern pieces based on their material resource, which in this case is textile headers. But in the case of all of them, their fabric combinations are predetermined by color. So what that does is it actually takes the designer out of the equation in terms of having to decide which textiles go with which textiles. and it turns it into a process that can be scaled up instead of a one-by-one basis, that actually can be done by a cutter or a sewer, because the fabrics are pre-sorted into color stories. So there'll be a beige bin, a black bin, a grays bin, etc. So the sample sewer or cutter knows that simply by putting their hand into that bin, that all of the fabrics in that resource are going to work with each other. So it doesn't require design oversight to say, yes, this one works well with that one. In the case of nudie jeans, of course, they're working with denim, so the bulk of their materials are, of course, blue to begin with, so they don't really need to pre-sort them into color stories. This is another example of a designer working with pre-consumer virgin textile waste, and this is the work of Luisa Savesi, based in Milan, and the brand called Revizioni. And Luisa's works with some of the tiniest and most worthless scraps of wasted materials, so such as thread balls or offcut selvages from production cutting. Selvages is a really major source of waste in large-scale production cutting, because the selvage of a fabric is usually woven tighter than the rest of the fabric. So when a manufacturer is laying those layers of fabric one on top of each other, usually the first thing they do is cut off the selvage. Because of that tight weave, it stops the fabric from lying flat, and they need it to lie flat for their production cutting. So it's a very common source of waste. Both of these bags in this case are made from textile, from those offcuts, selvages from textile or garment production. But she also uses really worthless pieces of absolute trash, effectively, such as thread balls from the factory floor. And what she does is she then encases them into a bio-resin and produces a whole range of purses and bags and totes, really beautiful line made from these wasted materials, upcycling them effectively into something that's very beautiful. So the previous examples of designers all work with wasted textiles from fashion supply chain. So the next couple of brands that I want to feature work with wasted materials and products from perhaps less traditional material sources. So this is an Austrian brand called Steinweider, and I think they're a great example of a really unexpected source and waste stream of non-traditional material reutilization. So, and they use upcycled sock waste. So every product that we produce makes waste, no matter what it is. So Steinweider used the sock waste from factory production, and they use quality control failures, they use cancelled orders, they use tests and dye lots and samples and so on, all of the things that aren't resold. So I want to finish this section, if you like, off with another example of pre-consumer waste, and this is the work of Rachel Frieri. It's not a recent example, it actually dates back to 2011, if you can believe it, from London Fashion Week. And I nevertheless still like to feature them because I think that it's an example of a little known or ill-considered source of waste, in this case from the leather tannery industry. And the garments that she produced that showcased during London Fashion Week are actually from discarded animal nipples. And they're a part of the skin that is discarded and removed right from the tanning process. So even designers that work and specialize in leather, it's a source that they haven't normally considered because they never see it. It's discarded before the leather skins even get to them for their cutting and sewing. So when she showed this work back in 2011 at Aesthetica at London Fashion Week, her work was initially lauded as just beautiful, sensitive use of wasted materials. That was until everyone discovered what it was, in fact, that she was using. And of course, animal nipples, the response many people had of that very visceral nature of the material that she utilized, were discussed for the most part. But what I think that she did super effectively was she drew attention to the source of waste that isn't even known about by most leather designers, because it is discarded down that supply chain before it gets to them. So it drew attention to a source of waste just not normally considered. So moving on to designers that work with post-consumer waste. I'll start with designers, again, perhaps that have more obvious sources of wasted garments and textiles, albeit perhaps slightly less traditionally. And this is the work of UK designer Bai Waleed, and he produces one-of-a-kind pieces from hand-picked antique fabrics, so materials such as vintage lace and hand embroideries, all upcycled into very beautiful, unique, exquisite, high-end design. So this is very much a case of a designer's oversight on a very individualistic, unique process of which materials go with which other materials. So somewhat similarly, this is an Italian brand of accessories called by Silent People. And they produce a collection of really beautiful bags, and they also use a really broad range of vintage and recycled materials. So anything from waxed barber jackets to Italian Red Cross field tents to 1930s German police jackets and absolutely iconic Italian leather motocross jackets, which you can see in the bag on the right here. And they're based in Bologna, and similarly, they produce every bag individually by hand. In both of these cases, it's about honoring the history, honoring the inherited tradition, the mythology around these very unique materials. So this is the work of UK brand called Elvis and Cressy. And they reclaim London Fire Brigade decommissioned fire hoses to produce a line of bags, totes, and purses. And so fire hoses, similar to a whole host of military and service industry materials, are discarded or decommissioned long before they're worn out. And that's because most of those materials play a role in the protection and health and safety of the wearer. And so that makes them a really great source of materials for post-consumer waste because they are discarded long before they're worn out. And such is the case with the materials that Elvis and Cressy use, these incredible discarded fireman's hoses into an absolutely exquisite line of bags and purses. So the final example that I want to share for post-consumer waste is British brand Bottle Top. So they were founded back in 2012, and the brand reused discarded ring pulls from soda cans, and they reused them by crocheting and weaving them into a line of bags. So it's a technique that is used right across Brazil. You'll see crocheted little purses and bags. Every craft producer across the small markets, local markets in Brazil. But what Bottle Top did was they took this very common process and they took it to an entirely new level by making highly polished, very sophisticated bags out of effectively an absolutely worthless piece of discarded aluminium. So the last few examples I want to use don't fall into either of those categories. So this is Spanish brand EcoAlf, and they produce a full collection of men's and women's outdoor clothing, and it's entirely produced from reclaimed materials and fibers. So not the usual reclaimed fibers, recycled polyester, for example, but things like ocean plastic and ground coffee grinds from the cafes across Barcelona, or car tires. And every item that they produce in their collection is fashioned from these reclaimed materials. So I think they were one of the first really to work with local fishermen. So to collect ocean plastic while they were out fishing, and then to drop off all of that collected plastic at the dock for recycling and reuse instead of it ending up in landfill or being thrown back into the ocean. So one of the challenges, the major challenges that we have with reclaiming fibers and fabrics is that most of our garments are made from multiple fibers and they can't effectively be disentangled for reclamation. So although there's an awful lot of technology and R&D in this space, very little of it has been scaled up for practical use beyond a 1-by-1 case to prove proof of concept, if you like, but not on a scaled up practical use scale. So the problem with recycling post-consumer waste goes well beyond this challenge of detangling frankenfabrics. So it also encompasses the utilization of a multitude of inputs from all sorts of different materials sources in the production of our garments. So not just the fabric, but the thread, the buttons, the rivets, the pocket lining, the labels, the fusing, etc., etc., etc. Each one of those often comes from a different combination of materials and fibers. So what that means when the garment gets to the end of its life and could be recycled, it means that most garments then have to be entirely deconstructed for fiber reclamation to happen. So for a garment to be recycled at the end of its life, it then has to be deconstructed before the fabric itself can then be recycled, and only then if the fabric is a monofilament. So the cost of the labor to deconstruct the garments is one of the main reasons why most garments are not recycled, because it is financially unviable. It's just not worth the labor to cut everything off the recycled fiber to utilize the leftover fabric. So unless you design into it for cyclability right from the beginning of the process. And this is one fantastic example of that. And this is Levi's Well Thread. And it's a response to that very problem. So they produce monofilament collection, where every input on a garment is from the same source. So in the case of a jeans, that might mean eliminating the rivets, only using 100% cotton thread on cotton pants. Most common thread, of course, is a cotton-wrapped poly core, and that's utilized almost on most garment production. So it means using 100% polyester thread on polyester pants, for example. It means making the pocket linings from the same materials as the labels. So this way, the entire garment can be recycled with absolute minimal or no deconstruction at the end of its life. But this takes really careful consideration for every single input in every single design right from the design stage. So this is a different take pretty much on the same concept of complete recyclability without deconstruction. And this is Freetag jeans, and they produce a completely biodegradable jean. So a bit like Levi's Well Thread, they had to eliminate the rivets. They don't use polyester thread amongst other mixed material inputs. The one thing they can't make, of course, from cotton or hemp, etc., is their jeans buttons or the zippers. So they designed a special jeans button that screws on and off easily, so it can be really easily removed before composting. So for their shirt buttons, what they use is a tagua nut, which is a Brazilian natural nut. And then every fabric that they utilize, every fiber is entirely natural, not just in terms of source, but in terms of processing. So it means they were dyed and treated without chemical use. And you can see from the bottom of this slide, this is the jeans biodegrading over the period of 3 months. So it can harmlessly go into that bio loop that Dr. Anna Brismar talked about in circularity and circular fashion. So this is just a really small sampling and a range of designers that have developed really beautiful responses to the multitude of material impacts that we have from garment and textile production. So there are many, many more, but I hope that by sharing them, it's inspired some of you. Not to limit your use of discarded materials to the more obvious sources and resources, as every item produced also has its own waste stream through the process of that production. So thank you very much.